Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to learn about drugs. Our last sections we learned about, how the neurotransmitter is released and the 6 steps at the synapse. So basically, most of the psychological effects of drugs happen at one of the 6 steps at the synapse. So what you have is drugs will either be an agonist, which will facilitate or mimic the action of a neurotransmitter, or the drug would be an antagonist, which would block the action of the neurotransmitter. Drugs can be an agonist for one neurotransmitter while simultaneously being an antagonist for another neurotransmitter. So when we say a drug has an agonistic effect on dopamine, it's saying that basically it's making dopamine work harder. And if we said it has an antagonistic effect on serotonin, then it's saying that it's not allowing serotonin to work. But most all psychological effects are coming simply from altering one of the neurotransmitters. So nearly all addicting drugs work on the neurotransmitter dopamine. As we learned, dopamine is our molecule of pleasure, and so the addicting drugs tend to work on dopamine. Also, an area of the brain that's highly associated with addiction, oops, that says addition, sorry about that, addiction is the nucleus accumbens. So I have a picture of that on the next slide. Let's just make sure that you had time to write down that addicting drugs have a tendency to work on dopamine. When we went over the neurotransmitters, I believe I had already put that in your notes. And then you can write this word, nucleus accumbens, but it's going to be on the next slide. Well, it wasn't on the next slide. So this is dopamine right here, and then we talk about that you just add one more bond right here, an oxygen-hydrogen to get the norepinephrine, and then here you've got one more. So if you remember, what are these called? The dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine? Do you remember what those are called? They're called the catecholamines, and we related a lot of behaviors, like why we do things under stress, why we seek pleasure when we're instant gratification when we're under stress, and we have a hard time planning for the future, and we make big mistakes when we're under stress, is because stress will deplete these, and so you need more of the dopamine in order to make more of the stress hormones to deal with your crisis. Okay, here's the nucleus accumbens, this area right in here. So this is the area that's associated with addiction, the nucleus accumbens here. I think I have other pictures, yes. So again, here's the nucleus accumbens right here, like a slightly different view. And then here it's showing it, and this purple pathways are showing lots and lots of dopamine. This is the dopamine pathways. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to learn basically about drugs. Then we'll go back to the first slide and show how they work at each of the six steps at the synapse. Okay, so LSD is by tabs. It's like on a litmus paper. It's the most potent hallucinogenic substance known to man to date. It stimulates serotonin receptors. I think that I have like a little video at the end to show you about it. It comes from this fungus that grows on ergot rye. There was a scientist that was trying to find out about the fungus and its effects, and in order to cure a disease, I can't remember what it was, but then that's how we found out about LSD. So the way that you could remember is, I think you remember that serotonin stimulates sleep. So LSD kind of produces a dream state where you're seeing all kinds of patterns and things even when you're awake. So maybe you could remember LSD, S for serotonin, and you could remember that it produces visual hallucinations. Now, for me, this definitely wouldn't be something that I would be into, because do you know that the LSD trip lasts for 24 to 36 hours. So basically you're hallucinating for 24 to 36 hours. Um, I tend to be a little bit of a type A personality. I like to be busy doing things. So the thought of just hallucinating for 24 to 36 hours just definitely does not appeal to me. I think I would much rather be reading a book. But who knows? Some people, may enjoy that kind of thing. But I didn't know if all of you knew that it lasts for quite a while. Okay, here I'm showing you how, as you can see, this is the serotonin molecular structure, and then you can see that you have this very similar. So we talked about a lock with a key, and so basically a drug goes in, fills the key, or a neurotransmitter attaches to a receptor, acts like a key, and opens it. And as you can see, this has some similar properties to it, so it would be able to also fill that space and lock the key. But it wouldn't be able to open the door the same way as serotonin, but it could fit into the lack of serotonin. Okay, mushrooms are another hallucinogen. These are going to create a much more mild effect than the LSD. They're natural. So psilocybin stimulate the serotonin receptors like the LSD does, but these are going to produce like a more mild, like seeing patterns of colors rather than a lot of visual hallucinations. Like with LSD, you kind of get a web pattern is very common that people report, and seeing patterns, whereas the mushrooms people report there's more changes in colors of light and as opposed to the patterns. Also, the mushrooms are only going to last around 6 to 12 hours as opposed to 24 to 36 hours. So again, the psilocybin from the mushrooms is going to stimulate the serotonin receptors. PCP is a different hallucinogen. So we've talked about LSD, we've talked about psilocybin. Those are two hallucinogens, and they're both working with serotonin. PCP is working with glutamate. So as you know, glutamate is the most common neurotransmitter in the brain, and so actually PCP is known as one of the most it has actions in so many different parts of the brain. It's the most complex drug. That's the word that I was looking for, the most complex drug. So PCP is going to produce a hallucination, but it's not working on serotonin, it's working on the glutamate. So what people say with PCP is that it produces more of a body sensation. So with serotonin in the mushrooms, you're kind of seeing things, and that makes sense because when you're in a dream state, the dream states are visual. But with PCP, you're kind of experiencing an out-of-body state. Like some people have told me that they were driving in their car, which under the influence of PCP, that's scary, but they were driving in their car and then all of a sudden they felt that the car turned into a rocket ship and they saw themselves going into outer space. Other people have said that they are on PCP and they like leave their body and they are kind of hanging on the ceiling watching their body down below. Now let's talk about this great strength that people think is associated with PCP. People on PCP, they don't tend to be very violent. I know that the Rodney King case begs to differ, but what happens is with PCP is their senses are heightened very, very high. And so, for example, if you put a flashlight in someone's eye when they're on PCP, they don't just see it as a flashlight in their eye. It's as if this huge, incredible light is just kind of attacking them. So their senses are very, very magnified. So if you say, "Hey, what are you doing?" they don't hear like, "Hey, what are you doing?" They hear, "Hey, what are you doing?" And it's very shocking, and so you get up and it's so startling. They don't get great strength from it, but what happens is their pain receptors are mitigated. So the reason why they can break out of handcuffs or they kind of demonstrate this super strength is because what stops us from breaking out of the handcuffs or what stops us from exhibiting great strength is the pain receptors. So since the pain is blocked, you can break the handcuffs because it's the pain around your wrist that's stopping you from doing that. And trying to lift something that's way too heavy, usually what stops us from doing that is the pain fibers from our muscles ripping when we try to do that kind of thing. Okay, here's cocaine. So cocaine is a white crystalline powder. It's inhaled, injected, or rock-like substance that can be smoked. Crack is made by pressing ammonia or baking soda with water, and it makes these little kind of rocks, and it's really condensing the cocaine into a very powerful, quick. But since it's so powerful and quick, it can cause the addiction very easily. Here I'm showing you how cocaine changes the brain. It says the neurological effects of cocaine can clearly be seen here. The cross sections on the left show a normal brain. Those on the right are that of a cocaine user after 4 months off the drug. The fronts of the brain are to the left in yellow areas show high activity even after 4 months. The user's brain is clearly still a lot less active. So actually what cocaine is doing is it's inhibiting the brain. You would think that, oh, it's such a stimulant that it's stimulating the brain, and it is. It's stimulating the nervous system by actually inhibiting parts of the brain. So by inhibiting an inhibitor, you actually get more a heightened activity, a heightened feelings. Here I'm showing pictures again. This is the brain normal, and this is the brain on caffeine. As you can see, there's bigger areas of the blue, so the red and the yellow is showing lots of activities. But on cocaine, it's actually inhibiting these areas. But by inhibiting an inhibitor, it can create larger feedback. Whoops, sorry. Okay. This is a stroke that was caused by cocaine. It's showing this black area all damaged. So how cocaine works is it works at the fifth step of the synapse. It blocks the reuptake of dopamine. So dopamine is supposed to be released, turn the key in the lock, and then be reuptaken. But cocaine, it blocks it from being reuptaken, so since it stays in the synapse, it causes dopamine to work harder. I kind of went over that in another one. So the effects of the cocaine is excitement, alertness, elevated mood, and decreased fatigue. Methamphetamine has very similar effects to cocaine. It kind of looks like cocaine. The reason why you see people stick their fingers into a bag of white powder is because I believe if you take the cocaine and put it in your mouth, it creates more of a numbing effect, whereas the methamphetamine does not. However, I'm not exactly sure on that, so I would need to check that out. Very similar effects to cocaine. It increases the release of dopamine. So this methamphetamine works a little bit differently than cocaine, but they are both working on dopamine. It works at step 3 of the synapse as it releases more, it causes more dopamine to be released. Now in past textbooks it is talked about that not only does it increase the release of dopamine, but it blocks the reuptake, so it makes it work extra hard. People have asked me, why do some people choose methamphetamine and why do some people choose cocaine? This seems to be kind of like what's more available, the territory, so on and so forth. Okay, here's nicotine. So nicotine stimulates the nicotinic type of acetylcholine receptors. So if I make that statement, what step at the synapse do you think it works at? If it stimulates the nicotinic type acetylcholine receptors. Okay, that would be stage 4. So nicotine goes in and acts like acetylcholine, and it stimulates those receptors. Caffeine blocks adenosine. So we didn't really talk about adenosine. It's not so much a household neurotransmitter, but by blocking the adenosine, adenosine inhibits dopamine. So that's back to this thing that I was trying to tell you about. Inhibiting an inhibitor can create more activity. So caffeine blocks the adenosine inhibits dopamine. So by blocking the adenosine, you're actually increasing the dopamine and the acetylcholine. So if it blocks adenosine activity, what step would that be? It would be step 4 because it's blocking adenosine from attaching to the receptors. Okay, so heroin and other opiates, what they do is they work on the endorphin receptors. So heroin can produce warm feelings, paranoia, insomnia, depression, dry mouth, flushed skin, nausea, elevated heart rate, vomiting, slurred speech. It affects the brain's pleasure and pain responses. So this, I tried to go over this before, is a heroin and the opiate drugs are going to produce a high that's it's different than a cocaine high. A cocaine high is like a big speed rush, whereas the endorphins, the heroin working on the endorphins is going to be more like a painkiller and much more peaceful, mellow feeling. Okay, here we have marijuana. So marijuana's medical uses are it alleviates pain, nausea, and weight loss associated with AIDS. It intensifies your sensory experiences. It distorts the sense of time and it decreased pain and nausea. So this one stimulates the anandamide receptors. So the anandamide wasn't discovered until the 90s. When I first took the class on Psych 2, when I was in school, they didn't even know how marijuana worked. You know, they would teach, we're not sure how it works. But then they discovered the anandamide receptors in around 92. This is a different neurotransmitter. It tends to work in the hippocampus. And marijuana is an interesting one because some people can smoke it and they feel nothing. And then some people can smoke it and they laugh and laugh and laugh. And then some people smoke it and they feel creative. Some people smoke it and they feel very mellow. So it's interesting that we have a neurotransmitter, anandamide, that seems to be linked to laughing, creativity, feeling of mellowness. So every drug, you have to know that we have a neurotransmitter inside of our body that acts the same way. Okay, alcohol facilitates the GABA receptor. So what it does is the GABA receptor is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's your anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. So alcohol produces an anti-anxiety effect by facilitating the action of the GABA receptor, which would be step 4 at the synapse. It also inhibits the flow of sodium across the membrane. So alcohol, then you remember sodium is what creates action potentials. So one of the reasons why alcohol is so dangerous and can have such a big effect on the brain is because it's working on every single neuron by inhibiting the sodium flow across the membrane. Also, your book goes into that it decreases serotonin activity but increases dopamine activity. I think for the test purposes, the main point that I would like you to know is that it facilitates the GABA receptor. I tried to really put everything in red that I wanted you to know in this PowerPoint. This is some interesting facts about alcohol use. Students drink 4 billion cans of beer yearly. 360,000 of 12 million undergraduates will die from alcohol-related causes while in school. That's very sad. Nearly half of all college students are binge drinkers. Average student spends $900 a year on alcohol, $400 a year on books. Probably you guys feel like you spend much more like that on books. So this might have been like from a few years ago. Books have gone up incredibly. Other social problems associated with alcohol consumption is correlated with crime in general, domestic violence. Did you know that most 90% of all rapes, that's including date rapes, stranger rapes, acquaintance rapes, they occur under the influence of alcohol? DWIs, driving while intoxicated. Economic costs are huge. The economic burden of alcohol and drug problems fall on the population that do not abuse alcohol or drugs. Okay, I'm going to go back and just show you a couple things. Okay, let's talk about the 6 steps at the synapse, and let's just show you just how each one of them could work. So the first step at the synapse was synthesis. So let me give you an example of a drug that increases synthesis, and then I'd like you to try to tell me, is that an agonistic effect or an antagonistic effect? Okay, so step 1 is synthesis. So the drug that I'm going to choose is L-Dopa. So we talked about Parkinson's disease earlier in another module here, and so L-Dopa is something that's given to Parkinsonian patients, and what it does is it increases the synthesis of dopamine. So it makes more dopamine, because if you remember, Parkinson's disease is low levels of dopamine. So would that be an agonistic effect, or would that be an antagonistic effect? If L-Dopa works at step 1 at the synapse by increasing the synthesis of dopamine, would that be agonistic or antagonistic? Okay, that would be agonistic because basically it's making more of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Okay, let's go to step 2. If you remember, step 2 at the synapse is transport the neurotransmitter to the vesicles. So Respirine is a drug that is given to heart patients, people who have a susceptibility to heart attack. Is when they release epinephrine, that's your stress neurotransmitter, and norepinephrine, that causes the heart to beat much faster. So what the Respirine does is it causes epinephrine and norepinephrine to leak out of the vesicles. So the vesicles will have less of a supply of the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, so therefore they can't have such a big effect on the heart. So it causes the epinephrine and norepinephrine to leak out of the vesicles. So would that be an agonistic effect or an antagonistic effect? Okay, that would be an antagonistic effect because basically it's causing epinephrine and norepinephrine to work less. Okay, we already did this one, but it's good for me to reinforce it, is methamphetamine causes more dopamine to be released. Would that be an agonistic effect or an antagonistic effect? That would be an agonistic effect because it's facilitating the action. Cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine. No, I'm sorry. We don't want to do that one because we need to do step 4 first. LSD attaches to the serotonin receptor sites. Okay, it attaches to the serotonin receptor sites. Would that be an agonistic effect or an antagonistic effect? Okay, that would be agonistic because it's mimicking the action of serotonin. And then we go to cocaine. Cocaine is blocking the reuptake of dopamine. So now this is where you can kind of be gotten. So I really want you to think about this. If it's blocking the reuptake of dopamine, what would that be? Okay, let me show you something that my students tend to have a hard time with. The moment that they see the word block, they go to antagonistic, but they didn't think about it. By blocking the reuptake of dopamine, they're actually making dopamine work harder. So that's actually an agonistic effect. Okay, let's do one more, the last step at the synapse, an MAOI, monoamine inhibitor. What those are doing is they are blocking the breakdown of the catecholamines and serotonin. Blocking the breakdown of catecholamines and serotonin. Okay, is that an agonistic effect or an antagonistic effect? Okay, that's actually an agonistic effect. Hopefully you didn't go with antagonistic because you thought that blocking, because you heard the word block, because it's blocking the breakdown. So if it can't be broken down, then it's going to actually be working harder. Okay, we're almost done. Where is the ecstasy? We don't have this on here. Okay, well, I'll see if I can just make one more on ecstasy for Okay, so let's go into ecstasy. Ecstasy is also called MDMA. It's a combination of speed and a hallucinogenic LSD designer drug. So it's a man-made drug. Basically, the closer a drug is to nature, the less harmful it is for our brain a lot of times. And so ecstasy is one that a lot of people think are safe, but I would tell you that this is one that you shouldn't mess with. In some people, it's been found to kill the serotonin neurons. So here it is. Ecstasy at low levels stimulates the release of dopamine. At high levels, stimulates serotonin synapses. They're saying that this is a brain toxic drug. It's a chemical that destroys the dopamine and serotonin neurons. And when you think about it, the dopamine is your neuron of pleasure, is your neurotransmitter of pleasure, and serotonin is the antidepressant. It's associated with antidepressant. So some people can take the ecstasy and they don't seem to have negative effects, but some people take the ecstasy and they're never quite the same. I mean, some of you may know people like that. And also, if you have a tendency for depression, I would really, really caution you to stay away from the ecstasy. Ecstasy is definitely something that you wouldn't want to play with because this is one that is thought of as brain toxic. For my discussion post, I put up that ecstasy was once used by marriage therapists to promote openness. So that's kind of what people feel. Let me see what we have here. Okay, we'll go back. Some signs of ecstasy use are if you see people walking around with pacifiers, that's usually not because they like babies. What happens with ecstasy is it makes their teeth chatter. So sometimes they need to suck on lollipops or pacifiers or something like that to keep their teeth from clenching and chattering. Also, since ecstasy is working on serotonin, it tends to throw the body temperature out of whack. So if you go to a rave, one thing that they'll do is they won't allow any backpacks in the door, and then they'll charge $20 for a bottle of water, and people will be willing to pay $20 for a bottle of water because they may be sweating so much from the use of ecstasy. Also, sometimes you'll have something like rub-down rooms where people are shivering and they rub each other because it's trying to warm them up. So ecstasy, serotonin works on the heart, and so ecstasy can throw your temperature really out of whack, which we know that your temperature has to be a stable 98.6 degrees so all the chemical reactions can happen at the right rate. So by throwing your temperature off, you're putting your body at a high risk. Also, it throws your heart rate off because of working with the serotonin, and so there can be some serious damage from the heart rate being thrown off. Here's another drug that I wanted to talk to you about is GHB. This is something else that's used at raves, but this is known as the date rape drug, gamma hydroxybutyrate. It's tasteless, salty, colorless, odorless. It assumes the properties of whatever liquid it has been mixed with. This is the date rape drug. And see, the GHB is something that that people could make if they want to, because it's just made out of chemicals from the hardware store, and it's a pretty easy recipe to make. The recipes are all over the internet. But what it does is the GHB, the reason why it's a date rape drug is it magnifies the effects of alcohol. So like if a person would normally be just kind of buzzed after one drink. By putting the GHB in their drink, it'd be like them drinking 3 drinks. And so what it does is it produces the whole blackout, the memory loss, so on and so forth. It's a central nervous system depressant. It's working like alcohol. But the thing is it goes through your system very fast. So the reason why it's used as a date rape drug is by the time she wakes up, the GHB is already through her system. So if she goes to the police, then probably it's going to be through her system. One other terrible thing that they do with the date rape drugs, the next one is going to be roofies, is that it's called booting. And so, as you know, probably to have sex with someone that's kind of passed out wouldn't be so fun. And so what they do is they put a little bit of cocaine in the vagina. Since she's passed out, she can't snort it, but they put it in the vagina and it passes through the vaginal walls, and it will, that stimulant will wake her up just enough so that she can kind of be fun, or just like at least a little bit into the sexual act. And see, then that protects them as well, because if she goes to the police and she reports a date rape, then she's actually going to test positive for cocaine. So there's coasters and things that you can buy that when you put your drink on it, they can sense the presence of a date rape drug. I would caution you to be very, very careful with leaving your drinks when you go to bars and clubs, because this is very easy to come by. Also, some people just use the G at raves just as a form of getting more intoxicated, so it's not always a date rape drug. Roofies is something that you can get by going across the border to Tijuana. It's relatively easy to get. So it's tasteless, odorless, so it's a pill form. They crush it up and then they put it in the drink. It's working with the alcohol again. It facilitates the binding of GABA to the receptors. You know, I wanted to tell you about this GHB is if they overdose someone on the GHB, then they go into a coma. When they knock out, they go into a coma. Now, if they come out after 72 hours, then they're going to come out. But if they don't come out after 72 hours, then the person's dead. That's why it's so dangerous. And it's very interesting because the coma that they come out of, they come out spontaneously. Most people, when they go into a coma, they come out of it very slowly, but the GHB coma, they come out spontaneously. The Rohypnol, I don't know about the coma part of this, but I know that there's absolutely very high risk of overdose, because whenever you mix a downer with a downer, which would be alcohol with this benzodiazepine, then the risk of death is very high, so you have to be very careful. Look at that, 10 times more potent than Valium. So it produces amnesia. The Rohypnol does not go through the system as quickly as GHB. This one's going to take about 24 hours to get through the system. Just one more note is, you know, the number one date rape drug of all is alcohol. So I said in the last one that 90% of all date rapes happen under the influence of alcohol. I think I just have one more thing to show you. This ketamine is a drug that I wanted to show you, because this is something that sometimes you'll see in the scenes now. Ketamine is very similar to PCP. The only place that you can get ketamine is from a veterinary clinic, because it's an animal tranquilizer. You can go across the border to get it, but it produces, when they talk about the K drug, it produces the effects of PCP, very similar. It's working on glutamate. It's a very complex drug. Sometimes people have a really bad trip on the ketamine, and so it's called going into the K hole. Inhalants. The inhalants are very dangerous to the brain. They kill brain cells, but you'll see people use the whippets, and they produce like a very quick high, sniffing paints. And this also nitrous oxide, it's like a laughing gas. So they produce a lot of damage to the brain by killing brain cells because of the toxic fumes. I don't really have too much to say about how they're working. That's an area that I need more research on, but I do think that I found a source where I can provide you a link for that.